Hi, I'm Joe Ruhl, and I want to welcome you again to another teaching video. I love sharing teaching ideas with teachers because I taught in the classroom for 42 years, high school students for 42 years. And during that time, I picked up some things, I learned some things along the way that I love sharing with other teachers, especially younger teachers and even new teachers. Things that I hope will help you, things that I wish I would have known when I first started out as a new teacher. I enjoy sharing teaching ideas like this because I really believe that teachers are involved in one of the most important professions on the planet. And a lot of times I've noticed when I talk to teachers, especially younger teachers, one of the main concerns that they have is how to maintain classroom discipline, classroom management. That seems to be a big concern. I have the opportunity occasionally to talk to pre-service teachers, that is, college students who are preparing to go out student teaching. And this is a number one concern that they have. So what I'd like to do is address some of those concerns in this particular video. So I've entitled this particular video, How to Prevent Classroom Discipline Problems. Now, we probably ought to clarify just a little bit. Let's be honest. Maybe I should change the title to How to Prevent Most Classroom Discipline Problems, because let's face it, we're never going to have a classroom that is 100% classroom discipline problem free. That's just not going to happen. That's just not the real world. But what we can do, I think, is minimize the discipline problems using what I like to call preventive discipline. So that's the focus today. Now, I loved teaching up until the last day of my career, 42 years in the classroom. I loved it. Had mixed feelings when I retired. Now, I can't say that it was always fun. Like, if you'll check out this picture right here, see the frown? Wasn't always fun. About halfway through my career, I'd say the 20-year mark, I started to experience that dreaded, okay, I'll go ahead and call it teacher burnout, and sort of having doubts about whether I was in the right profession. And was it time for a change? And then, I had almost, you could call it like an epiphany, I suppose. I was standing in the hallway in between passing periods as the kids are going to and from their classes, watching the kids and watching their behavior, the posturing, the courtship displays, the mating behavior, you might say, just the antics that normally go on among teenagers as they're crowded together in the hallway going from one class to another. And the thought struck me. It just hit me. It was almost like a light bulb went on above my head. And it was just a realization on that particular day. I'll never forget it. And it was a discovery. Now, it may not seem like a real profound discovery, but for me it was profound. And that was the realization that I don't teach biology. I teach kids biology. And like I said, it may not sound like a profound discovery, but for me it was. It was like this light bulb moment. And suddenly I began looking at kids differently. And I remembered saying to myself, yeah, these ninth graders are immature, but of course they're immature. They're 14 and 15 years old. And when I thought about that, and it seemed like on the days when I was intentional about remembering that I don't teach biology, I teach kids biology. The days when I was intentional about remembering that seemed like the days when teaching and learning were most effective and most enjoyable for both me and the students. So it was like this realization, that kids are high energy, they're social, they're fun, they're funny, humor is important to them. It's just the nature of the way they are, the way they're put together. And then, some modern scientific medical brain research that I've been interested in and looking into kind of verifies that observation, because modern brain research is showing that our brains appear to be wired for social behavior. I mean, makes sense. We are a social species. And no wonder they're interacting so much in the halls and between classes. They are a social species. And then brain research is also showing us that our brains are wired for love. That's the way our species is made. Our brains are wired for being loved and giving love. That's how we're made. And there's another way that our brains appear to be wired, and that is our brains are wired for humor. We humans appreciate humor. Now, we have different styles of humor, different ways for different people, but it's something that's kind of unique to our species. As far as we know, unique to our species. Now, there may be some of that developed in other animals, but not nearly to the extent that we see in humans. And then there's another way our brains appear to be wired that's uniquely a human characteristic. Our brains are wired for creativity. Unique to human beings, we humans we gain satisfaction from being creative. It's a self-satisfying, pleasurable activity. And these are all going to come into play as we talk about some of the ways that we can set up in our classrooms preventive discipline measures. Now, about the same time I had this realization, this epiphany, if you want to call it that I don't teach biology, I teach kids biology. About the same time, I was trying to move from what I would call a teacher-centered classroom to more of a student-centered classroom. I was intentionally making that move. And so these two, I guess I would call them attitude adjustments in me, a realization that they're kids, and I teach kids biology. And the other attitude adjustment, moving to a student-centered classroom, both of these generated a very dramatic change in my thinking and in my teaching methods that generated a wave of job satisfaction and enthusiasm that carried me all the way through to the end of year number 42. So these discoveries, they happened about mid-career, carried me all the way to the end. Now, when I'm talking about a student-centered classroom, I'm not talking about what we see in this picture right here. Okay, this is your typical teacher-centered classroom where the teacher is up front and center, the authority figure, dispensing information to the students, and the students are supposed to just eat it up, right? And take notes and so on. And I found that when I moved to a student-centered classroom setting, where I was not the sage on the sage, but the proverbial guide on the side, where I was letting the kids do the work. Lecturing is a lot of work. Letting the kids do the work, then I noticed discipline problems plummeted, which was kind of exciting. So these were a couple discoveries that I was very excited about. And one way that I took myself off stage is I developed these computer tutorials, interactive computer tutorials using an authoring program called Adobe Director. It was pretty time consuming. I did it in the summertime when I wasn't teaching. It's not for everybody. There was quite a learning curve in learning how to do the programming. So it's not for everybody. But I'm kind of geeky that way. It was sort of like a hobby. And what I did was I created these interactive, self-paced computer tutorials that in class the kids would work through with headphones on. They would work through these at their own pace. It engaged them more than a lecture. In fact, I designed these lessons so that they would take the place of the topics that I used to lecture on. The kids enjoyed them because I tried to incorporate humor and animation and so on, and video clips and whatnot. And the kids actually enjoyed them. And throughout the course of the computer tutorials, I would put in questions that would pop up on the screen to check for understanding, to make sure that the kids were intentional and paying attention to what they were doing as they worked through the computer lessons. And then while they're doing this, they're filling out their study guides. This is their note-taking activity. This is how they're getting the content. Almost all the kids preferred that. Over 90% of the kids preferred that method of instruction as opposed to me lecturing. It engaged the kids more. So I did have one little guy, though, who told me, you know, Mr. Ruhl, I think I like your lectures better than the computer tutorials. And when I asked him why, his answer kind of set me back a little bit, caught me off guard. And he said, because when we're listening to a lecture, we only kind of halfway have to pay attention. But when we're working through those computer tutorials, we like totally have to pay attention. And I got kind of a chuckle out of that, and I thought, well, okay, that's good feedback for me. Now, not everybody's into developing computer tutorials, like I said. And so there are other ways that you can take yourself off stage and make your classes more student-centered, where the kids are doing the work. And I have a website. Right here's the URL for that website. And if you go to that website, you're going to find a place where you can download documents that I've put on the website. And there's a document on there called Taking Yourself Off Stage, Different Ways of Going More Student-Centered. The website, when you go there, looks a little bit like this. And in the upper right-hand corner of the website, there's a label right there. It's called Documents to Download. You can click on that, and it will take you to a page that looks like this. And if you look carefully on this page, there's a document right there. And it's got other ideas that you can use to take yourself off stage, make your class more student-centered. Other ways besides developing computer tutorials. And I think you'll find those useful. So what's the secret to effective and enjoyable teaching and learning? Making it effective and enjoyable for both students and teacher. And I think it's probably no secret that the secret is relationships. Relationship in the classroom is huge. Being intentional about developing positive, appropriate teacher to students relationships. It's huge. And it's built upon a foundation of teacher caring, aka love. And I'm not talking necessarily about warm, fuzzy, emotional love, because let's face it, some kids are hard to like. No, I'm talking about not necessarily emotional love, but decisional love. Putting the other first. Trying to do, to the best of our ability, what's best for the students. That's the kind of love I'm talking about. So, it's taught me, those 42 years taught me that building relationships is critical. Now, let's think about that for a minute. You know how a lot of times substitute teachers, especially if they don't really know the kids and the kids don't know them, they have a lot of trouble sometimes. Not always. Why is it that substitute teachers have sometimes a difficult time? Well, I think the obvious answer is they don't have a relationship with the kids. They don't know the kids, and the kids don't know them. Relationship is huge. Now, I didn't come up with this on my own. Believe it or not, students actually taught me about the power of love. or the power of compassion. It was taught to me by students and some other people. But I remember, I think it was the spring of 1987. It was a dark night of despair and sadness, because I remember it was a time when my wife miscarried. And it wasn't easy for us to conceive. I guess you might have medically classified us as infertile. And so when we did conceive, and my wife was expecting, that night when she miscarried, it was devastating. It like gutted both of us. And I remember after a couple days of staying home with her and the doctor's appointments and so on, I remember dragging myself back into school after having a substitute teacher for 2 or 3 days. And I remember thinking, as I walked through those dark hallways, because I arrived like 2 hours early, and I knew I had a lot of things I had to do to catch up. I knew I had to prepare for the day's lesson, which was going to be very difficult. And you'll find out why it was very difficult. I remember dragging myself through the halls to my classroom, putting one foot in front of the other, and I remember thinking, I don't know if I can do this. I don't think I can do this. My emotions just aren't there. I don't know if I can bring it. And it was especially difficult because the lessons that we were going to be starting, and this was back in the days when I was doing more lecturing, we were getting ready in biology to start a series of lessons on the wonderful, miraculous process of human embryo development. And I thought, as I walked through the halls, I can't do this. I'm just not in the mood. But that process of embryo development with those wonderful Nielsen photographs that I was using as slides, those photographs that detail the process of human embryo development from a fertilized egg like this that we can see under the microscope, which is no bigger than a pencil dot. That process of that fertilized egg developing into an embryo and eventually a little fetus. In other words, a miniature human no bigger than, could take a nap on the face of my watch. Called a fetus at that point. Happens in only 49 days. Develops to that point in 49 days. It's got all the organs, brain, liver, kidneys, small intestine, large intestine, pancreas, stomach. Everything is developed in just 49 days. Not much bigger than this. Miraculous, wonderful, complex biological process. And I thought, how am I going to do this? I decided I'm not just going to wimp out and just show a video or something. I'm going to go through with the lessons because that's what it's time to do, and it's time to be professional, and it's time to buck up. And you know what? Those ninth graders in those biology classes all day long sat on the edges of their seats, perfect ladies and gentlemen, taking notes, giving me the occasional subtle little smile and nod that tells and encourages a speaker, hey, I'm with you. And I realized word gets around fast in a school. The kids knew why Mr. Ruhl had been gone. They knew. They knew what happened. And they were perfect ladies and gentlemen. Even my third period biology class, which was the squirreliest group of 10th and 11th graders, because many of the kids in that class were second and third time repeaters of biology. Perfect ladies and gentlemen. I mean, you would have thought they were like graduate students in some seminary, paying close attention. And you know, at the end of that squirreliest class, the bell rang, everybody was dismissed. On the way out, several of them came up to me without even a word and hugged me on the way out. I learned about the power of love and compassion that day, how it can motivate people. It can bring out the best in people. Power of love. I think it's important to think about what kids think. I don't know if you've ever heard of this particular researcher. His name is Ruhl. And he has actually a YouTube video entitled, What Makes a Good Teacher Great? You see, what he did was he interviewed 26,000 high school students across 8 different school districts. He interviewed them. And the question he asked them very simply was, what makes a good teacher great? I think we've probably all realized that kids are going to be most responsive and most respectful of a teacher who they view as being skillful and not just good but great. And so he asked the students, what makes a good teacher great? There were several responses that they came up with, but a couple were common to almost all 26,000 students, no matter what schools they came from. A couple big ones. Number one, the first one was, the teacher likes us. A teacher is great in their eyes instead of just good if the teacher likes them. That's what they said. And I found that very interesting. And so that raises a question. So how can we show our kids that we care? What are some practical ways to do that? Now, I've got 6 practical ways I'd like to share with you. And they work. 42 years taught me that they work. Number 1, learn the students' names as soon as possible. And remember and use them inside and outside of the class. And then also, along with that, learn something about their interests outside of your class. Learn their names. Use them often. When you see them in the hallways, when they're not in class, use their name. There's something powerful about addressing someone by their name. Kids perceive that if we do that we care. They perceive that we care if we do that. That's item number 1. Now, how did I do that? Well, on the first day of school, I would have the kids pair up with one another and interview each other. And I would reveal on the screen, on the board, a list of these topics right here. Name, birth date, extracurricular activities, hobbies, interests, part-time job, if any. You can see them on the list here. Favorite food, favorite movie. What do you want to be when you grow up? Grow up. And so I told the kids, I want you to take out a sheet of paper. I want you to number 1 to 8. You're going to write down this information, not about you, but about your partner. I want you to interview your partner, write this information down about your partner. And then when you're finished, you're going to flip, and your partner's going to interview you and write down stuff on his or her paper about you. And then when there's enough time for everybody to interview their partners, I'm going to have you come up to the class a pair at a time and introduce your partner to the rest of the class. Now, what this did, I found, is it shifted those first day jitters from me onto the kids. It also showed the kids from the get-go, I think, that this class is going to be kind of student-centered. And so when we did that, when it was time for the kids to come front and center in pairs and introduce our partner to the rest of the class, before we started doing that, I said, okay, it's only fair, if I'm going to make you do this, it's only fair for me to go first. So I did that, and I stood up there and I told them my name, birth date, and all this kind of stuff. Then when the kids were doing it, I sat kind of in the back of the room and I carefully took notes. On a seating chart, I took notes about each kid. And I paid special attention to the pronunciations of some of the names. I figure if I let the kid's partner introduce him or her, they're going to have that name down, and that way I'm not butchering it and embarrassing them and belittling them in front of their peers. That's not something we want to do to a fellow human being. And so then I would collect all their papers at the end of that time of interviews and presentations. I would collect those, and I made myself study those diligently that night so that the next day I could use their names. And I even knew something about what their interests were. It's all part of being intentional about trying to develop relationship, which is huge, like I said. Suggestion number 2, stand by the door and greet students by name as they arrive at your classroom. Now, sometimes this is hard to do because we get rushed and we get in a hurry, but it pays dividends, I'm convinced. If you do this, kids are going to perceive that you care. If you stand by the door and greet them as they come into class. This is not a new idea, but I recently saw some fairly recent, well, in the last 15 years or so, something like that, educational research that supports this idea. Allday and Pakurar, actually I guess it was 2007, published these findings from educational research that suggested, it showed that when we greet kids, especially problem kids at the door when they're coming into class, if we greet them, even if it's no more than a smile or a thumbs up, if we do that, we actually increase student engagement from 45 to 72%. So it's a little thing, but it pays off. Suggestion number 3, have a sense of humor. Be able to laugh at yourself. Very important. Humor is important to kids. Now, I'm not a good joke teller. My jokes tend to be dad jokes, so I shy away from that. My humor tends to be more along the lines, I guess, of self-deprecating humor. It kind of softens the heart of your listeners. And I remember, actually learned it by accident. When I was a first-year teacher in Macon, Georgia, I was in a big inner city school, very different setting than what I grew up in rural, small town Indiana. Inner city school, Macon, Georgia, first-year teacher. And in the first week of school, I was preparing to show a film strip. Now, many of you probably don't even know what a film strip is, but we had these projectors that you would loop a film strip into that had a series of slides, and there was even a, you don't know about these either, cassette tape player hooked up to it that had narration in it, and it would advance these slides automatically. It usually had some boring narrator voice doing that. Slide number 1, slide number 2, and so on. So I had this all set up and ready to go. I was going to show a film strip to my biology students. I was a first-year teacher. It was in the first week of school. I started to get ready to show that, and when I pushed the button to play the tape, I was quite surprised because it wasn't the narrator that I heard. Not at all. Like, whoa, I thought, oh, and of course the kids are laughing and just losing it. Someone had slipped a tape into the tape recorder of music that was popular at the time. Now, you got to remember, this was the late 1970s, okay? Now, I had seen kids outside the school building with the boom boxes on their shoulders. Now, remember, again, it's 1978. Boom boxes on their shoulders, listening to music and watching them dance. And the dance that they were into that was popular at that time was one where you just basically stand with your feet together and you bob your upper body up and down like a chicken. And I remember I stopped the tape. Of course, I stopped it. And for some reason, I guess I did the right thing. Looking back, I did the right thing. When the laughter died down, I started it up again and started dancing the way I saw the kids dancing outside the school building. They laughed, they had a good time, they settled down, I took the tape out, I put the right one in, we proceeded on, and they were angels the rest of the period. So I think humor is important, and kids will perceive that you care if you have a sense of humor. Number 4, move from teacher-centered to student-centered. I've already briefly mentioned that earlier in this lesson. move to a student-centered classroom, I found when I did that, where the kids are doing the work. And there's a lot of evidence to back this up, that those who do the work do the learning. Now, of course, I'm working. I mean, it takes a lot of work on the front end ahead of time to set up a student-centered classroom. It takes a lot of preparation on the front end, but it pays dividends. And I noticed that when we were in this student-centered environment like this, that provided opportunities for me to sit down with small groups of kids who maybe were confused or having trouble and work with them eye to eye. Actually sit down with them and work with them shoulder to shoulder. And I discovered in that kind of a setting, it was a whole lot easier to build relationship, because I was in that setting, sitting down with them. I was removed from the traditional teacher image to more of a coach or a mentor or a nurturer, and it enhanced the relationship building. In addition to that, of course, it's sound pedagogy to get the kids involved in their learning in this way, as opposed to passively sitting in a lecture. Number 5, engage kids in small group work and allow for freedom of movement. So in my class, when I did this, it reminded me, yeah, kids like to move around. They like to be involved. They're high energy. They're social. Remember, that's how their brains are wired. They liked this. And I think the reason they liked it is because that's how their brains are made. It makes sense, because their brains are wired that way. I don't know how many kids I had who would confide in me and tell me in private, because they would never do this in front of their peers, obviously. That just wouldn't be cool. They would say things like, "Mr. Ruhl, I love biology." And I thought I would hear, because chromosomes and genes and DNA are so cool. No, that wasn't the answer they gave me. The answer was, because we get to do stuff in here. An important lesson that I learned from the kids. Number 6, allow time for project work. Project work. Remember, our brains are wired for creativity. This is a student that I had in class way back in the 1980s. 1980s. And you can see the picture was taken off of a film print, and some Scotch tape has kind of torn off a little bit of the film, unfortunately. But this student, for her project, and this was an optional activity, she baked a couple cakes and decorated them with different candies to represent different parts of the cell and different cell parts. And so as part of this project time, the kids were required to not only design and make a project, but then they were supposed to, when they finally had class time to present their projects, we called that Arts and Entertainment Day, they had to actually teach about their project, use the things that they had produced to teach the biological concepts that were demonstrated in that particular project. And so she had to not only build or make these cakes and decorate them, but she also had to then teach in class her peers about a 5-minute lesson on what the parts were, what the names were, and what the functions of those cell parts were. Well, wouldn't you know, about 20 years after she graduated from high school, I ran into her at a football game at our school. And she came up to me and she said, "Mr. Ruhl, do you remember me?" And I said, "Of course, I remember you." And she said, "Do you remember when I made those cell cakes for biology?" And I said, "I remember, like it was yesterday." And she said, now this is 20 years after I had her in class. And she said, "I still remember those cell parts." She said, "I remember the mitochondrion, the powerhouse of the cell. I remember the endoplasmic reticulum. It's like the subway system that runs through the cell. I remember the ribosomes, those little particles in the cell that manufacture proteins. I remember all those cell parts. Now, in this picture right here, you can see I ran into that same student like 20 years after that first encounter at the football game. So this is decades after I had her in class. She came to my book signing, and I thought, I know why she remembered all that stuff that she taught decades ago. It all goes back to, I don't know if you remember this researcher or not, William Glasser. Based on his research, he said, students retain, they remember, they keep 10% of what they read, 20% of what they hear, 30% of what they see, 50% of what they see and hear, 70% of what they discuss with others, 80% of what they experience personally, and 95% of what they teach to others. Thank you, William Glasser. That explains why she remembered all that stuff. Kids liked the projects. And I think, again, it's because our brains are wired for creativity. That's one of our uniquely human characteristics. So back to Azul Terrones, who said, what makes a good teacher great? Remember, he said the first item was the kids said the teacher likes us. The second thing almost all kids mentioned, all 26,000 over 8 schools, and that was number 2, the teacher is passionate about the subject. That's very true. I would never have survived college statistics if my professor had not been madly in love with statistics and was so passionate about it. We could see that in her. If it hadn't been for that, I don't think I would have survived statistics. I don't know if you realize or know who this person is in this picture, but the man on the left is Mr. Fred Rogers. Remember Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood? Some of you might be too young to remember that show. But on the right in this picture is his mentor, child psychologist, Margaret McFarland. This is what she said about teacher passion. Attitudes aren't taught, they're caught. If a teacher has an attitude of enthusiasm for the subject, the student catches that, whether the student is in second grade or graduate school. So true. Now, sometimes you have to be an actor, especially in the late afternoon. But you got to bring that passion. You got to somehow maybe be an actor. You've got to bring it. Bring that energy, and that'll bring the kids along. It works. Now, this is not my 3rd grade teacher from a long, long time ago, Miss Hershey, but this Norman Rockwell painting reminded me of her. And I will never forget, 3rd grade, after our noontime recess, we'd all come back into the classroom, all these sweaty kids, it's after recess, after lunch, and we'd sit down, and for like the first 10 or 15 minutes in the afternoon, she would read to us from The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. She started at the beginning of the book. By the end, she had read the whole book to us, but she only read like 10 to 15 minutes a day. And she would inevitably end at a cliffhanger. And I remember sitting there thinking, this is so cool. This is so much better than the cartoons on our black and white TV back home. This is so cool. And it was obvious to me that she loved reading. She was passionate about it, and she loved reading to us. And I look back, there I was, a 3rd grader. She inspired me to be a reader. Thank you, Miss Hershey. I'll never forget her. So let's review. What are ways that we can show our kids that we care? Number 1, learn their names as soon as possible and use them inside and outside of the class. Number 2, stand by the door, greet the kids by name as they arrive at your classroom. Number 3, have a sense of humor. Be able to laugh at yourself. Number 4, move from teacher-centered to student-centered. Number 5, engage the kids in small group work and allow freedom of movement. And number 6, allow time for project work. These are not only sound pedagogy, but the kids like it. They like it. Now, all of this, of course, is good for the kids. That's the way their brains are wired. It's all good for the kids, but what about us? What about the teacher? What about the teacher? Now let's think about this for a minute. Let's think about careers, jobs. What kinds of careers are going to result in the most job satisfaction? I think it's probably any career that allows one to, first of all, cultivate human relationships. Why is that? Remember, our brains are wired to be social. That's how we're made. I think we thrive on that. Cultivate human relationships. Any career that allows us to love. The medical research shows us, brain research shows us, that our brains are wired for giving love and receiving love. And that when we do give love, do charitable acts, it actually stimulates pleasure centers in the brain. This is based on medical research. So a job where we're allowed to do those kinds of things, I think are going to give us job satisfaction. And any job where we're allowed to be creative. If we can find a profession, if you can find a profession where you are allowed to do those things, I think that's where you're going to find job satisfaction. Now, think about our profession, teaching. Are we in a situation where we can cultivate human relationships? Does teaching allow us to love, not necessarily emotional love, but decisional love? Does teaching give us opportunities to be creative? You bet. Now, I will be the first to admit teaching is hard work, but I found it satisfying and fulfilling. And I think the reason I did feel those things is because I felt like I was leaving a small piece of the world a little bit better than I found it. It's hard work, but nothing that's really worthwhile is easy. It's hard work, and it allows you to do these things that our brains are wired for. Relationship, love, and creativity. That's how our brains are wired. So we, of all professions, of people of all professions, we're fortunate because we're able to do what our brains are designed to do. Now, this is not a cure-all. Okay, the things I've talked about are going to minimize classroom disruptions and minimize discipline problems. Most of them, almost all of them. But what about that occasional problem child who still manages to find a way, despite our best efforts, to be disruptive or disrespectful? How do we do this? How do we deal with that kid? Well, I'll share just one example of something that I did that worked out very well for me. I remember it was a typical day, and I was front and center at the class like I usually did at the beginning of each day. Good morning, happy Tuesday, or whatever. Had a few announcements. We always had a few announcements that I had to make before turning the kids loose on the activities for the day that they knew about, that I had informed them about. And so that was a situation where I was, for a brief time, front and center, teacher-centered, making those announcements. And I remember I had a kid who was a little squirrely. He's in the back, and he was trying to talk to somebody else while I was trying to talk. And so I just stopped what I was doing, and I said, mentioned his name, and I said, I'm going to make up a name here. Bill, time out. When we break to start going to all the various activities, I want you to hang around just for a minute. Come on up. I just want to chat with you for a little bit. That's it. And then I moved right on with what I was doing. And he kind of looked like this. And what's Mr. Ruhl want to chat about? And so I kind of let him be in suspense, let him squirm a little bit. And so once it was time for the kids to be turned loose to go to the various activities, the student-centered activities and learning stations and so on, then I stood there at the front of the class with these papers in my hand, acting like I was distracted, going through some papers and stuff, looking down at the papers, and I sensed that he was slowly making his way up to the front of the room. And so I was pretending like I didn't see him coming, of course. Maybe that was dishonest. I don't know. But when he finally got to me, I looked up and I go, "Oh, Bill. Oh, yeah. I just wanted to chat with you for a little bit." So I said, "Let's go out in the hall. Come on out here. I just want to chat with you for a bit." So we went out in the hallway. Of course, I kept the door open. I positioned him in the hallway so that he was not visible to his classmates. And I was visible so that I could keep, I know chameleons are good at this. We're not good at this. But keep one eye on the class and one eye on him. You know what I'm talking about? And I remember telling him in no uncertain words what he was doing wrong or inappropriately. Very, very firm, no uncertain terms what I expected going forth from that point on. Because I had learned before that time, I had learned that if you confront a kid, most of the time, if you confront a kid who's disruptive in front of the rest of the class, he'll feel like he has to save face. Like he's going to have to put on a macho kind of act in front of everybody else. A challenging stance in looking at the teacher in a challenging way, just to kind of save face. So I learned that that just doesn't work. You're going to lose every time if you try to correct and confront a student in front of his peers. So that's why I took him out in the hallway and had the conversation the way I did. And incidentally, before I even had the conversation in concrete, certain terms of what I expected, I told him, the reason I brought you out here is I didn't want to put you down in front of your classmates. And I saw him kind of thinking about that a little bit, like, oh. I noticed a lot of times if you confront a student one-on-one in this way, even the most disruptive, ornery kids will at least act like human beings. Having a one-on-one conversation seems to help. So anyway, these are just some ideas that I hope will help you. I thank you for tuning in to this particular video, and I hope that your teaching career as it goes forward will be fulfilling, exciting, and that your kids will respond positively. How to prevent most classroom discipline problems. Thanks for joining me.